Going through the God Delusion. This is number 15, Richard Dawkins' book. We're in chapter 4, why he says there almost certainly is no God. He says natural selection. He says when large numbers of these slightly improbable events are stacked up in series, the end product of the accumulation is very, very improbable indeed. Improbable enough to be far beyond the reach of chance. What? Did you get that? Do you know what he's saying? I'm thinking what he's saying is that natural selection, he says the answer is that natural selection is a cumulative process which breaks the problem of improbability up into small pieces. Each of the small pieces is slightly improbable, but not prohibitively so. When large numbers of these slightly improbable events are stacked up in series, the end product of the accumulation is very, very improbable indeed, improbable enough to be far beyond the reach of chance. So I think what he's saying is that, well, you can't just have everything happen at once, because that's very... it just wouldn't happen. It's beyond the realm of probability that everything just happened all at once. It's got to evolve over time. And so the answer is you have to break up everything into small pieces. And when you break up into small pieces, every little thing is improbable, but not beyond the realm of probability. So it's probably not going to happen, but it could happen. But then, when you add up all of these slightly improbable events together, the probability of all of those things happening is very, very improbable. And so since it's very, very improbable, it can't be by chance. So then it must be natural selection. I think that's what he's saying. Well, so natural selection then isn't by chance, is what he's saying, because it's far improbable enough to be far beyond the reach of chance. So if it can't be chance, then it must be design. It must be an intelligent design. Oh, no, it's not that. It's natural selection. So exactly what is natural selection? He's saying it's not chance, because it's too improbable for it to happen by chance. But yet he said there's no creator. It can't be intelligent design. So it's natural selection. But he doesn't really tell you what natural selection is, except all it is breaking up the large thing into small pieces. So each piece then is only slightly improbable, not impossible. But yet he admits that all of them together are very, very improbable. So since they're very, very improbable, and he's already eliminated design as a possibility, and it's very, very improbable, far beyond the reach of chance, so chance couldn't do it. So it's got to be this natural selection, which he hasn't explained what it is. So natural selection is his code for it's not random. It's not by chance, because that's too improbable. But yet he won't admit to a God or a creator. So he's got something that's sort of in between, that it just happened this way. But he doesn't tell you how it happened, and it's not chance, it's natural selection. All this doesn't make any logical sense. And yet just 2 chapters earlier, he was talking about how superstitious religion is, and how he bases everything on rational thought. Yet this goes completely against rational thought. Later on he says, quote, Darwin himself said as much, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can find no such case, end quote. So basically he's saying that if, this goes back to the topic of this section, I think, yeah, irreducible complexity. If you have, say, a human being, and the human has to be formed exactly like he is, with everything intact, and it couldn't be these different smaller events, then the theory of evolution, according to Darwin himself, breaks down. It couldn't have happened that way, because a complex being couldn't just randomly form. But if you can break it down to numerous successive slight modifications, then that's okay. And he says he can't find a single case where you can't break something down into numerous successive slight modifications. Well, I don't exactly see how that is. The DNA, for example, it's 2 strands of DNA. It has what? The improbability of just 1 strand of DNA. We're talking about something that's within your cell. We're not talking about your entire body. We're just talking about a single cell. And in that cell, that the probability of the 250 proteins or whatever it is in a single strand of DNA being there and being in the correct succession in order for that cell to be a living organism is very, very improbable. Almost, you would probably say it's impossible that it would happen randomly. But yet he says that he could break it down to numerous successive slight modifications. Well, really, you can't. You could break it down to that, but it's just so improbable even at that time, even at that level. And even Dawkins just admitted a few pages earlier that the end product of the accumulation is very, very improbable indeed. So he's just contradicting himself. Darwin says, well, if you just got to have the human body form just as it is from nothing, just right away, from something to nothing, just instantaneously, then his theory breaks down. That can't be it. So you got to break it down into numerous successive slight modifications, and that can work. But yet Dawkins says that the large numbers of slightly improbable events brought together makes everything very, very improbable. And so essentially it doesn't really matter if you break it up into smaller events or if you have the whole. Either way, it's impossible for these things to happen. But yet it is possible because of natural selection. But we don't see what natural selection is. If it's a law, well, somebody had to make the law. If it's a design process, then it's the design process that an intelligent designer used. If it's not one of those, then it's chance. But he says it's not chance, but yet it's not a designer. So what he's saying doesn't make sense. He goes on to say, however little we know about God, the one thing we can be sure of is that he would have to be very, very complex and presumably irresistibly or irreducibly so, end quote. So wait a minute. So a man is not irreducibly complex. He's simple enough that they could string together a large number of slightly improbable events together to make this man, although it'd be very, very improbable for that to happen. But yet the more we know about the human body, the more we find out that it is very, very, very complex. God says you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Just like I say, the cell, they didn't know about the cell structure when Darwin wrote this in 1800s. And now they know that 250 proteins have to be within a single cell, and all the DNA has to line up just right. And we're just talking about 1 strand. Then you got a second strand, you got 2 strands in the cell, and then you got all the cells that get together and form, you know, the human body. And then you got all the immune system, the conscience, everything together. It can't just come out of nothing. It's incredibly complex, but yet they don't see it that way. But then God, they say, a God, if he created everything, must be very, very complex and presumably irreducibly so. So man couldn't just form like that, because you can break him down into slightly improbable events, meaning that he formed by natural selection. But God, because he is so complex, he would have to be formed like that. And because nothing could be formed like that by chance, then God must not be there. There must not be a God, because he had to be created at some time. Therefore, God doesn't exist. All this stuff is just psychobabble. It makes absolutely no sense. How did you determine that God had to be formed like that, but a human did not have to be formed like that? How did you come up with that? How do you figure out what is irreducibly complex and what isn't? And again, even if it's not irreducibly complex so that it could be formed, well, again, how does it form? By this natural selection process. It sounds like chance to me. Well, no, it's not chance, it's natural selection. Okay, so nature is your God. Nature selected it. Nature designed it. If it's not chance, then it must be some kind of design then. Dockett says, well, the choices aren't design or chance. Well, yes, they are. It either happened on purpose or it happened accidentally. When you get into an auto wreck, it was either an accident or it happened on purpose. There's no middle ground. You can't say, well, it wasn't an accident, but it didn't happen on purpose either. It's a process that we call neutral. It's just sort of, it happened not by design, but not by chance. And so it's just a series of small successive events that took place, very improbable events that took place together, which means it's not an accident, but it's not on purpose either. Well, even if it's slightly, you know, either you wrecked the car on purpose or you didn't wreck the car on purpose. There isn't any middle ground. It's either or. It's either purpose or an accident. So if you're saying that it can't be chance, it's just slightly improbable events together, well, then there's still a purpose behind that if there's no accident. There is a purpose behind that design. So if it's natural selection, it's not chance, then it must be design. So they've created this middle ground where there is no middle ground. They've made up some category. Even if you say it's the law of natural selection, well, somebody had to make that law. They had to put order in there to come up with the law of natural selection. And so then that whoever did that, whoever put it together, then is God. He designed it. So all this stuff that they're saying doesn't make any sense. Goes on, he says, one of the truly bad effects of religion is that it teaches us that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding, end quote. And as we said before, that's exactly what Dawkins does. He calls Christianity a religion where you just, it's a good thing to be satisfied with not understanding. But he's saying that he has understanding and science, and that's good. He has the awe of understanding as opposed to the awe of ignorance. And he'll take the awe of understanding over the awe of ignorance any day. But what he's showing in this chapter is he's the one who's ignorant. He can't explain to me, well, it's not chance, it's not design, it's natural selection. Well, natural selection has to be either chance or design. It can't be, and there is no middle ground. So he's the one who is not understanding it, and he's satisfied with it. But yet I completely understand how the world was made. God made it. And I don't have to worry about who made God because God has always existed. We've read that before. Hebrews chapter 7 talks about that. So I have complete understanding about the creation. Now the details of how God did it, I may not know that, but I know there's a God and he made the creation. It's completely logical. But what he's saying is completely illogical. That large numbers of slightly improbable events are stacked up in a series, and the end product of the accumulation is very, very improbable, so it can't be by chance, but yet it's not by design. But yet if I can't reduce it into these very, very improbable events, then it has to be by design. So therefore God doesn't exist because he's not he's irreducibly complex, and so no one could have made God. God couldn't happen by natural selection or by chance, so he had to be made, and since there is no one above God, then there must not be a God. But yet I, as a human, am not irreducibly complex, that I could have these slight number of events that take place, but yet all of that is very, very improbable, but yet it somehow happened, but it didn't happen by design, and it happened by chance. That's convoluted. He's got no understanding. And yet he says one of the truly bad effects of religion is that it teaches us that it is a virtue to be satisfied with not understanding. That's what Dawkins is. He's satisfied with not understanding. He doesn't understand how it was made. I understand it. So he's the one in religion. He's the one, whereas I've got rational justification and facts and documented evidence to show what I believe is true. He has no documented evidence. He says, quote, many evolutionary transitions are elegantly documented by more or less continuous series of gradually changing intermediate fossils, end quote. So he says, well, we know natural selection happened because of all these intermediary fossils that we've seen out there. Well, where are these fossils? I haven't seen. They tell me. I mean, think about it, if you're a scientist and you've got this theory, we know that there is a God and he is worthy of worship, but yet we don't want to acknowledge him so we can continue in our sin. So it is a huge, huge advantage for us if we can find out that there is no God and that we were just here by chance or natural selection, whatever you want to call it, and there is no God, because then we're not subject to anyone. We can be our God, own God, and we can do whatever we want. And so there would be a lot of money in that to have so-called documented evidence to prove that there is no God by having these intermediate fossils. So they could very well make up these fossils. I mean, that's what Westcott and Hort did when they wanted to change the Bible back in the 1800s, is they came up with a corrupt manuscript. They invented corrupt manuscripts, or they took one that was already in existence that nobody cared about because it was corrupt. They made it authoritative, and now they've based all their perversions of the Bible on this corrupt manuscript that they made up. So couldn't evolutionists do the same? They don't have any evidence, so they just make up the evidence of these fossils to show progression in time. And even if they didn't make it up, even if they did truly find these fossils, well, the question is, who put the fossils there? If they are truly there and they find those fossils, that doesn't mean that man evolved through these intermediary steps just because you find the fossils. Maybe Satan put them there. That's what he did with the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs never existed. There's no evidence of that. But yet, 87 Jurassic Park movies have been made. And there's this Jurassic period. That never happened. It's completely made up.
Usually they find only one bone, and it's a big bone, and they say this was a T-Rex, and they make fake little bones to go with the big giant bone that they found, and say it was a dinosaur.
Yeah. They go on to say, no such anachronistic fossils have ever been authentically found, despite discredited creationist legends of human skulls and the coal measures and human footprints interspersed with dinosaurs, end quote. So basically what they're saying is they haven't, all the fossils they've found support natural selection and evolution, and they don't support creation. Again, they have great motivation to find the fossils they want. You think an evolutionist or an atheist who finds a fossil that is contrary to what they believe, they support, you think they're actually going to come out with that and try to discredit the science community? They'll be banned. They'll lose their job. They'll lose their credibility. No one will listen to them, and they'll lose their livelihood. So even if they found these fossils, they're not going to let anybody know about it. He says, no attempt is made to demonstrate irreducible complexity. But I would say examples abound of that, besides burden of proof with evolutionists. I mean, there are 3 billion rungs on DNA ladders that they say. The number of letters in one DNA strand, and this is what I found online, the number of letters in one DNA strand, there are 2 DNA strands, I believe, in each cell, but the number of letters in one DNA strand is equivalent to 20 Encyclopedia Britannicas. So they say, well, no one's ever attempted to, they just say the human body is irreducible complexity, and so it can't be designed by natural selection. You can't reduce it by that into small pieces. but there's no attempt made to show that. Yeah, there is. There's all kinds of attempts. They're shown that the DNA strand has just one DNA strand in one cell. When there are two DNA strands, one DNA strand has the number of letters of 20 Encyclopedia Britannicas. That's irreducibly complex as far as I'm concerned. So, but yet that's not what they say. They say, quote, it is plain. So basically they're saying, well, the creationists have done nothing to try to prove their theory of this irreducible complexity. And yet they show the DNA strand and how complex it is. You can't even reduce that. You need to reduce that to something smaller. If the number of letters equal 20 Encyclopedia Britannicas, it shows that even the DNA strand couldn't have happened by chance or by natural selection. That DNA strand is irreducibly complex, but yet they ignore that and say, well, no attempts have ever been made. Creation is showing all the time how impossible evolution is, and Dawkins ignores all of that. He says, even if no scientists do come up with an explanation, it is plain bad logic to assume that design will fare any better. So even if scientists, so basically what they're saying is, even if scientists have no way of explaining their own theories to be true, it's bad logic to assume that design people could do any better. So in other words, we're not even going to give intelligent design people or creationists a chance to explain anything. In other words, science has all the answers, religion has no answers, or Christianity has no answers. So if science cannot explain their own theories, and because science has more knowledge than intelligent design people, then we don't even need to give intelligent design people a chance to explain, because they're more idiots, they're more ignorant, they're stupid compared to evolutionists. So since evolutionists can't explain, we won't even ask design people to explain it. So what it does is it shows that they won't even listen to any argument that any creationist has. You want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, what's so funny is they say, you know, Jesus, God doesn't exist, but yet they go out of their way to try and prove he doesn't exist, and to make sure that nobody hears the message. And it's like, well, if he doesn't exist, you call the Bible a fable, something, just stories and stuff. Well, you got stories of Zeus. You got stories of all these different gods. You got Hindus that got 2 million gods. But yet, you'll allow stories to be told of those, but not Jesus. Jesus is the only one they're threatened by. They can't handle it. And it's so funny that a man that they claim doesn't exist or never exist, and if he did exist, he was only a human, you know, a guy walking the earth, and like the Quran, they say he was just a good teacher, a good prophet, but you know, he can't perform anything. Why are they so threatened by somebody they claim that doesn't exist? They won't even let the Bible be taught. And it's like, you know, okay, so you don't want it to be taught as religion. Well then, why don't you just let it be a good novel for kids to read? But you won't even let that.
Yeah,
because they're afraid.
They allow fiction to be taught, and fiction books, read fiction books all the time. So why not let the Bible be taught? Why not let people read the Bible? It shows that they know that it's not fiction. The book, he goes on to talk about Penn and Teller and having a routine in here. He says, quote, those people who leap from personal bafflement at a natural phenomenon straight to a hasty invocation of the supernatural are no better than the fools who see a conjurer bending a spoon and leap to the conclusion that it is paranormal, end quote. So basically what it's saying is that Penn and Teller do these magic tricks, And everybody knows, even though you can't explain it, they know it's a magic trick. They know it's fake. But if you believe it, that Penn and Teller are true magicians and they are true powers, that's just like a creationist. It's just like a creationist who says God created the world. Well, how do you know? You can't explain it. So you can't explain it, then it must not have happened. And so he's comparing the creationist to people who are ignorant enough to believe that Penn and Teller truly have magical supernatural powers.
I would think if I was Penn and Teller, I'd be mad at Dawkins. I'd be like, what did you just call our fans? Did you just call them idiots? Is that what you just called them?
Well, he's saying that he thinks the people that watch Penn and Teller are smart enough to know that even though they can't explain what they did, they know it's a trick. That they didn't defy the laws of God. They didn't defy the natural laws. They're not supernatural people.
I don't know. Some of these kids growing up had watched Penn and Teller, and they wanted to become so-called magicians. So wouldn't you say that these kids sort of believed that it happened?
But the thing is about Penn and Teller is that they don't go against God's established laws. Bible believers go with the laws, and evolutionists do not. The theory of thermodynamics, the law of thermodynamics, is that something goes from more energy to less energy. It goes from order to disorder, unless you put energy into it. There's no, if anything is done by chance or by random, it goes from order to disorder. It goes from something that's orderly to disorderly. That's the law of nature. But yet evolutionists say, that's the law of thermodynamics, but evolutionists say, no, everything started in disorder and it went to order. So what evolutionists are believing is they are believing in something that goes against laws of nature. But with a creationist, we are going with those laws. We recognize that things go from order to disorder unless there is some energy put forth to make it into order. And in this case, it would be a creator. The only way the earth and life and everything came together would be a creator putting it all together. So we are going with the law of thermodynamics. Evolutionists are going against the law of thermodynamics. Penn and Teller, they are going with God's established laws. Now they're fooling you into thinking, either optical illusion or whatever they do, they're fooling you into thinking that they have supernatural powers. But they don't really. And Dawkins admits that. So really, the creationists are the ones who are on the side of the people who are not fooled by Penn and Teller. Because Penn and Teller goes with God's established laws, not supernatural powers. And creationists believe in those who go with the established laws. God created things. Evolutionists are the ones who are duped because they go against those established laws. Next page, he says, quote, in evolution, the organ or structure you are looking at may have had scaffolding in an ancestor which has since been removed. End quote. Now that's very interesting. There is this book, 7 Clues to the Origin of Life by the Scottish chemist A.G. Cairns Smith. And he's talking about the fact that if you've got these, if you reduce something that's complex and you reduce it into smaller steps, and then the smaller steps come together, he says that there are many structures that are irreducible in the sense that they cannot survive the subtraction of any part, but which were built with the aid of scaffolding that was subsequently subtracted and is no longer visible. And so he says, quote, in evolution too, the organ or structure you are looking at may have had scaffolding in an ancestor which has since been removed, end quote. Well, what that suggests, scaffolding suggests intelligent design. That's not evolution. Or natural, it's not even this natural selection, which you say isn't by chance, but it is. But how is that? You know, scaffolding, for example, you're building a building. Well, then you build the scaffolding around wherever you are so you can get up to this area to build a further part of the building. But then when you actually get all the building built, or you get that part, then you take away the scaffolding because you don't need the scaffolding anymore. The scaffolding was just an intermediary step to help you build the building. So scaffolding, the only purpose of that is when somebody is creating something and they have purpose and design, that they would create this scaffolding. But he says in evolution, a structure that exists now may have had scaffolding in an ancestor which has since been removed. Well, who removed the scaffolding? It must have been the person who created the scaffolding. Well, if somebody created the scaffolding, then they removed the scaffolding, then there is a designer. In other words, if it's all random, if it's by chance, this couldn't happen. So what he's saying in natural selection is not only were all there were a large number of successive events that were improbable to happen in themselves, but together they're very, very improbable. And so they all happen by this natural selection, whatever that is, and yet somehow the process of natural selection that built all these successive steps to come out with the end product somehow went back, removed scaffolding that was added to make the end product. Well, by the fact that you added scaffolding, you just showed right there that it was irreducibly complex, that it all had to happen at once. So what they're doing in trying to explain evolution is they just keep digging a bigger and bigger hole for themselves. To say that all these things have to happen, a large number of successive improbable events that make it very, very improbable, and wait, there had to be some of those events that had to go back and remove some intermediary stuff that was in there that was necessary to get the next step, and so you had to go back and get rid of that. So what you've done is you've just added more steps to it. You said it was already very, very improbable for this to take place, these successive events, but yet it somehow happened, and now you've added more events to explain how they could come apart together. In other words, if God is just able to snap his fingers and boom, make something, well, then that something wouldn't take as many steps as if he has to make this little piece, and this little piece, and this little piece, and this little piece, and then you put all the pieces together. Well, in order to put all the pieces together, you need this scaffolding in order to, you know, intermediary stuff, then you take the scaffolding away. So Dawkins has admitted that evolutionary process or natural selection requires many more steps than intelligent design does. And yet somehow those extra steps were taken by natural selection, and then the part that wasn't needed or wasn't necessary for that complete organism, not only did all the things get put together in an intricate way for it to work, but then these other things were created in addition to each little piece in order to get it all together. For example, let's say the eye, let's talk about the face. So the eye forms all by itself by natural selection. Well, then the nose forms all by itself by natural selection. And then the mouth forms all by itself by natural selection. And then somehow, though, the eye didn't look exactly like the eye you have now because it's going to have to be attached to the face, and the nose has to be attached to the face, and the mouth has to be attached to the face. So there had to be some scaffolding or extra parts that somehow were added to the eye, and so that when the time came for all these things to come together magically somehow, that then it would work. And then when everything came together, now the extra part that was on the eye, or the extra part that was on the nose, or the extra part on the mouth somehow was removed. He says, scaffolding in an ancestor which has since been removed. Well, how do you remove it? How does it all form in the first place, and how do you remove it? And how would all this happen if it's not by design and it's not by chance? It can't happen by chance, he says, because it's too improbable. It can't happen by design because design means there's a God, and there can't be a God because God couldn't be designed in this process of eye, mouth, and nose. He'd have to be designed at once, and since there's no power out there to design a God at once who could do all this, then there is no God. So then God doesn't exist, So since God doesn't exist, there's no designer. So since there's no designer, then it has to be by a process that's not by design and it's not by chance. But yet, when you look at all the steps that had to be done in order for this to happen, it has to be a designer. Because he's already admitted that all this is very, very improbable. And then he has to add extra steps to make it work. So that's a designer. You know, if I build a building, well, I need those extra steps to build the building, to get the scaffolding up there, to get to the part up there that I needed to get. And then when I get that done, then I can take the scaffolding down. That any scaffolding is a clear design thing. It's done on purpose. Do you have something? He says, quote, "The key to demonstrating irreducible complexity is to show that none of the parts could have been useful on its own." So, end quote. So basically what he's saying is that the body the human body cannot be irreducibly complex, because you would have to show that the parts couldn't have been used on their own. But all parts of your body are like that. So by his own admission, then, the human body is irreducibly complex. Because, for example, let's take a hand. You know, the hand, the fingers can move, it can grab things. But if it is just by itself, if the hand is cut off, it does absolutely no good. Because it can't grab anything. It's not connected to nerves. It's not connected to blood vessels. It's just a dead piece of meat. It doesn't do anything. Any part of your body cannot function on its own. It has to be everything together in your body. So, the key to demonstrating irreducible complexity is to show that none of the parts could have been useful on its own. Well, it's obvious. What good is the eye going to do if it's just an eye sitting on the ground? It can't see. It can't communicate with the brain to say what it is. It wouldn't do a thing. What good can a hand do just sitting on the ground by itself? Nothing. It can't grab things. It can't lift things. It can't do anything. So by Dawkins' own admission, the human body is irreducibly complex, which means there had to be a designer, intelligent designer. All right, thanks for watching.